Then we'll go for the land acknowledgement. And I'm just gonna start by um, saying the Ganahela Dunksla. It's the Thanksgiving address. And what it means is the words before all else. When we present something, we bring our minds together as one. So I'm going to say it in Oneida language, but I'm also going to explain it in English so that you know what I'm saying. So Sagoli Swagwe, hello everyone. Deyontqua Nyungets. Deyontqua is my Oneida name. Wagegwaho ni Wagitaload. Wolf is my clan. And Onyataaga ni Wagohajod. Oneida is my nation. That's the land that I come from. So I'm just going to start with the Ganahela Dunksla, the Thanksgiving address, the words before all else. So it starts with, we're giving thanks to everything in creation. And so it starts with saying, Agwego Huskaji and Wahuinuni Ungwahnigula. So that's saying that we're going to bring our minds together as one. Dedwa Nuheladu Nengunjukwa. And that's we start with giving thanks to the people. Jit Segugadoga, Neo Dini Galoda, and that we can still be in that good way. Dane Tonyo, Duhagine and Guapnigua. That's kind of saying like, so that's how it will be. And when we give thanks to every element, it starts the same and it ends the same, but the words change in the middle depending on the element we're giving thanks for. So, but I'll explain each one to you as we go through. So that was the first one. We start with giving thanks to the people. Agwego Huskaji and Wahwinuni and Guahnigula. Doing 18 Nuheladu and Yunki Noha. Jit Segugadoga, Neodini Galoda, Dane Tonyo Duhagene and Guahnigula. And that gives thanks to our mother, the earth. Agwego Huskaji and Wahwinuni and Guahnigula. Doing 18 Nuheladu and Onega Nasogu. Jit Segugadoga, Neodini Galoda, Dane Tonyo Duhagene and Guahnigula. That gives thanks to all the waters. Agwego Huskaji and Wahwinuni and Guahnigula. Doing 18 Nuheladu and Guahnio Handes. Jit Segugadoga, Neodini Galoda, Dane To Nyoduhagene and Guahnigula. That gives thanks to the small plants. Agwego Huskaji and Wahwinuni and Guahnigula. Doing 18 Nuheladu and Onunkwa Ogu. Jit Segugadoga, Neodini Galoda, Dane To Nyoduhagene and Guahnigula. That gives thanks to the medicine plants. Agwego Huskaji and Wahwinuni and Guahnigula. Doing 18 Nuheladu and Oyunkwa Uwe. Jit Segugadoga, Neodini Galoda, Dane To Nyoduhagene and Guahnigula. That gives thanks to the sacred tobacco. Agwego Huskaji and Wahwinuni and Guahnigula. Doing 18 Nuheladu and Junhekwa. Jit Segugadoga, Neodini Galoda, Dane To Nyoduhagene and Guahnigula. That gives thanks to our sustenance, the corn, beans, and squash. Agwego Huskaji and Wahwinuni and Guahnigula. Doing 18 Nuheladu and Galunde Su. Jit Segugadoga, Neodini Galoda, Dane To Nyoduhagene and Guahnigula. And that gives thanks to all the trees. Agwego Huskaji and Wahwinuni and Guahnigula. Doing 18 Nuheladu and Gundilio Su. Jit Segugadoga, Neodini Galoda, Dane To Nyoduhagene and Guahnigula. That gives thanks to all the animals. Agwego Huskaji and Wahwinuni and Guahnigula. Doing 18 Nuheladu and Ojit Dahasu. Jit Segugadoga, Neodini Galoda, Dane To Nyoduhagene and Guahnigula. That gives thanks to all the birds. Agwego Huskaji and Wahwinuni and Guahnigula. Doing 18 Nuheladu and Owela Su. Jit Segugadoga, Neodini Galoda, Dane To Nyoduhagene and Guahnigula. That gives thanks to the winds. Dane Onaga Nuua, De Galiwakashu Ainek, Gahawidu, Galiwayandekwa. So now we're going to break it up and give thanks to everything above. Agwego Huskaji, and Dwahwinuni and Gwahnigola. Doing 18 New Hela Dunin, Ladisa Gayan Des. Jeet Segugadoga, Neo Dini Galoda, Dane Tonyo Hagine and Gwahnigo. That gives thanks to the thunders. Agwego Huskaji and Dwahwinuni and Gwahnigola. The Hetwa New Hela Dunin Etwa G. Jeet Segugadoga, Ni Hodini Galoda, Dane Tonyo Hagine and Gwahnigo. That gives thanks to the sun. Agwego Huskaji and Dwahwinuni, Ngwahnigola. Dulang 18 Nuhela Dunin, Yonki Sut. Jeet Segugadoga, Niodini Galoda, Dane Ton Yoduhagine Ngwahnigo. That gives thanks to the moon. Agwego Huskaji and Dwahwinuni and Gwahnigola. Dulang 18 Nuhela Du, Nin Yonjisto Kwalu. Jeet Segugadoga, Niodini Galoda, Dane Ton Yoduhagine Ngwahnigo. That gives thanks to the stars. Agwego Huskaji and Dwahwinuni and Gwahnigola. Dung 18 Nuhela Dunin Gaye ni Ungwedagate. Jeet Segugadoga, Ni Odini Galoda, Dane Ton Yoduhagine and Gwahnigola. That gives thanks to our helpers. Agwego Huskaji and Dwahwinuni and Gwahnigola. Dung Hetwa Nuhela Dunin Sungwaya Dizo. Jeet Segugadoga, Ni Hodini Galoda, Dane Ton Yoduhagine and Gwahnigola. That gives thanks to the creator. Dane tohniole ne galiwa gweni ji nate galiwa yandekwa. Ne andwelhage skana andwat dunyuhage. Dane to nigawanak. So that's saying that's as far as I've come with the words in giving thanks this morning, and that we will all think peace in our minds as we come together today. And this is a topic that I don't speak on often. And I was even a little bit reluctant to do this topic because it's not an easy subject. It's not an easy subject to think about. It's not an easy subject to research. It's not an easy subject to gather information on. But I also knew it was an important subject to know the true history of the original peoples of this land. And I also just wanted to preface this by saying that I'm not speaking directly on behalf of any individual residential school survivor, because they all have their own story. They all have their own experience. I'm sharing, the intention with my words today is to share knowledge that has helped me have a better understanding. And so when we look into our past of colonization, of cultural genocide, of, assimilation, it started a long time ago. And when, I guess it kind of just started from like the first contact, in 1492, when Christopher Columbus came across the ocean. So Christopher Columbus was later called an explorer, but this boatload of people that came across the ocean weren't good people. They came across as they were kind of being shipped out of their own country because they were criminals, they were murderers, they were rapists. And when they shipped them off, they didn't know then that the world was round and that they was going to connect to another piece of land. They shipped them off on a boat thinking that it was gonna fall off the water, like Niagara Falls. They thought, they would ship them off, they would fall off the edge of the water, and they would never see them again. But those people came to Turtle Island, North America, the original homelands of many different nations. And they were met when we met each other, when the first contact, when they were met, they later said that they were treated like kings by the indigenous people of the Americas, because that was what we did. We took care of each other. We had non-judgmental compassion for each other. So when we seen someone in need, we took care of them. And so you fast forward a few years, and these people, these men that came over, that made contact, they went back and they said, there's this beautiful land, and these people treated us like royalty. And so then they start, traveling back and forth because they knew there was more land on the other side of the ocean. And that was the first contact of colonization. So a few hundred years go by, and, we did start to understand that they didn't come with good intentions. And we battled. We end up having some battles, for a few hundred years. And millions of people were killed during that time. And then the residential schools were introduced really by like Christian or Catholic missionaries early in the 1600s. They weren't well populated yet. It was kind of like they were practicing, I guess. And then they really didn't start to open and populate these schools until the 1800s. But the purpose of these schools was to commit cultural genocide on people because they wanted to take our land. And when I was thinking about it, I thought, like, I can't believe that people sat in rooms together and had conversations saying and talking about how are we going to commit cultural genocide. And they had their ideas, and they said, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to build these schools, and we're going to do everything we can to break down these people, these indigenous people of these lands, starting at the age of 3 years old. And so that happened. These schools were built. The children were taken. Sometimes they were forcefully taken. Sometimes they were like coerced into, making the parents think that this was going to be a good place for their children to learn and grow. But the sad truth is that these schools were created to break down the indigenous people's original ways of knowing. They were created to remove our languages, our ceremonies, our way of life. And they did this through many different forms of abuse. There was physical abuse. There was sexual abuse. They had, if you weren't physically or sexually abused, you were emotionally abused because you knew what was happening. There were times where they were starved. They were fed rotten food. There were still schools that had electric chairs in them. And it started at the age of 3. That's a baby. I can't imagine, you know, being taken at that age and then living at this school until you're 18 years old. And so these schools, they did a lot of damage, but we're still here. And we are still navigating the post effects of residential schools because every single Indigenous person to North America has felt the post effects of residential school. Every single person is related to someone who went to residential school, whether it's a grandma, a grandpa, an auntie, an uncle, a brother, or a sister. The last residential school closed down in Canada in 1997. In 1997, I was 19 years old. So this happened for hundreds of years. And it was a secret, I guess, in a lot of ways that was kept. And this is a conversation that even as Indigenous people, we don't have this conversation a lot. Like understanding the post effects of residential schools, it's a conversation we need to have because we're all affected by it. But it's a conversation we don't have. Even knowing about residential schools, I didn't grow up knowing about residential schools until I was really in my 20s. And so up until I was 20, residential schools were still open. And I didn't even know about them. So, and even like I have a grandmother that went to residential school and she never talked about it. Just like a lot of residential schools survivors, for a long time, they didn't talk about it because they didn't know how to express, how to find the words, how to tell anybody what really happened. Because in these schools, they were shamed into a lot of things, and they were told, if you tell anybody, this is going to happen to you more. Your family isn't going to believe you. Your family doesn't want you anymore. They've said a lot of things. There was so much emotional abuse. Over the past, 10 years, I've worked with a lot of residential school survivors. I've worked with children of residential school survivors, grandchildren of residential school survivors. And, I don't ask questions, but if they want to share, I will always listen with compassionate ears and a compassionate heart, because I know it's not an easy story for them to tell. And so through the years and, hearing bits and pieces of their stories, it's so heartbreaking. And when I ask them, what do you want to happen? Like, what would make you feel better? And most of them say, I just want people to know the truth. We just want people to know what really happened. And then was it like 2008, the national apology came in. And so that opened up a, a conversation that wasn't had in a long time. People started to open up after that. People started to tell their stories. People started to share with their families, even. And it helped Indigenous people make a little bit of growth because it helped us to understand why our families were the way they were. We have grandparents and great grandparents and sometimes parents that went to these schools from a young age and were never taught compassion. They were never taught that love was a healthy thing. And so when they grew up and raised children, you know, they didn't know how to teach that to their children. So a lot of times we'll say we grow up and we felt like our parents didn't love us. And we had some resentment towards our parents because we felt like they didn't take care of us. But it wasn't their fault. You know, as Indigenous people, when we get to a certain age, it's mostly in our 40s, we have to start to forgive our parents and forgive our grandparents that they did the best that they could with what they knew at that time. And we also have to forgive ourselves a lot, you know. And my understanding of forgiveness isn't necessarily forgiving someone that hurt you, but forgiving yourself for holding on to that pain for so long. And so the work I do today is I try my best to help my people remember how special they are, remember how smart they are, remember how creative they are, remember how innovative they are, because we've come a long way through trauma and seeing all of those post effects of all that trauma that we've carried for so long. The work I do today, I just try to lift that a little bit, a little piece at a time. And so throughout colonization, throughout genocide, throughout all of these things, we lost a lot of our ways, but we didn't lose them totally. We still have our original ways of knowing. We just have to, we're still practicing on bringing them back to normalcy, I guess. And we're almost, we're losing our languages, but we're working hard to protect them. My grandparents, I still have grandparents that are alive, and I know I'm lucky to be in my 40s and still have grandparents. Um, and my grandparents that are still alive today, they didn't go to residential school, but they did go to residential day school, which was, in the community. And they were still like physically, like they would get strapped for speaking Oneida language. And this was in, the 40s and the 50s. And my grandpa tells me stories like, they would go to school and they the teacher had this big strap, and every time they would say a word in Oneida language, they would get hit with that strap. And my uksot, my grandmother, she would have to write lines. I will not speak Oneida language. I will not speak Oneida language. So my grandparents didn't teach my parents how to speak Oneida language, but they did it because they thought that they were protecting them, because they were raised in that way of being punished for years and years for speaking their language. They didn't give it up, but they took that beating every day. And so they didn't teach their children because they thought that they were protecting them. So then my parents didn't teach me. So we lost that fluency in 2 generations. But now my grandparents are teaching me. And I'm also like learning on my own. And like Haudenosaunee languages, they're some of the hardest languages to learn because it's so complex linguistically. And I tell my grandparents, I'm like, do you know how smart you are? Because you're a fluent speaker, you can flip that language within milliseconds. Like they think in Oneida language, but in milliseconds, before they say the word, it comes out as English. I'm like, you have to be a genius to do that. And they're like, no, we're not smart. Like, so I'm still trying to help my grandparents, build their self-esteem a little bit because it was so broken. And so those are some of the post effects. I was at a conference once, and we were talking about corn. It was like a corn resurgence. And because corn is so special to the Indigenous people of the Americas, it's a gift. Corn is a gift that's been given to the world by the Indigenous people of the Americas. And so we're at this conference about corn, and there was a non-Indigenous doctor there, and he did a presentation, and he talked about he was privy to certain records from residential schools, and he had seen the records from residential schools on how they were doing testing on the children in residential schools through their food. And the post effects of these tests, they caused high blood pressure, they caused diabetes, they caused infertility, they caused a weakened immune system. And so because those tests were done and all of those on those children for all those years, it starts to become part of your DNA. So then when you have children, they have weakened immune systems and they're more susceptible to other health conditions. And it came from the residential school. It was another part of cultural genocide by not giving us access to our traditional foods. And so we're still, we're still healing every generation. In this, I believe that if you're born in this day and time, you're born to heal, no matter what nation you're from in the world, because there's a lot going on in the world today. And every single person born in this time is on a healing journey. And, however you heal, whatever, you know, works best for you, it's helping you. But when you heal, healing is linear. So when you start to do your healing, you'll heal your parents. You heal your grandparents, you heal your great grandparents, but you also heal your children, your grandchildren, and your great grandchildren. So that's one of the beautiful things about healing. And then through the years, we've suffered many socioeconomic injustices that we're still fighting. You know, Indigenous people today are still fighting colonization. There's a lot of things. There's a thing called the Indian Act, and it was created in 1876. And the Indian Act made, ceremonies illegal. The Indian Act also made laws where people would lose their status. If an Indigenous man graduated university, he would lose his status. If an Indigenous woman married a non-Indigenous man, she would lose her status. But if an Indigenous man married a non-Indigenous woman, she would gain full status. There have been changes to the Indian Act over the years, and there still needs to be more changes now. Like with our children, in care, we have the highest numbers of children in care. We have the highest numbers of children or of adults that are incarcerated. And even with children in care, if an Indigenous child gets adopted by a non-Indigenous family, they lose their status because they get a new birth certificate. And if their parents on that birth certificate aren't Indigenous, that child loses their status. But they can fight to get it back once they turn 18. Like, I think that's like, there's so many things that blow my mind. And I know we're fighting for all these things. It's just so much to take in. And, fighting that cultural genocide is the biggest part of a lot of, a lot of what we live on a day-to-day basis. So when I give thanks, when I did the Ganahela Dunksla in the beginning, that's, sometimes I think, it's a beautiful thing that our people can still be thankful through everything that we've been through. And that's like one of our most important teachings, is to still have that thankfulness, because it grounds us and it takes care of us. And the fact that we can still do that through everything we've been through, that's a beautiful thing to me. And it's a beautiful thing for our children. I guess talking about residential schools is more of a mature conversation, because we don't tell our children, even to this day, like, you kind of learn about residential schools when you get to a certain age, because it's so traumatic. because it was so abusive. We don't tell our kids about those things, and it's to protect them. And so when we think about how do I make this better, how do we fix this, it's going back to the basics, and bringing that thankfulness back into our own families, having that non-judgmental compassion for each other again. And I feel like COVID COVID sent a lot of teachings. um, COVID taught us how to have non-judgmental compassion for each other, because in the beginning of COVID, with there was a lot of fear, because we didn't really know what was happening. And so the beginning of COVID, when people would first get COVID, there was a lot of shame with it. There was a lot of, a fear of the unknown. So people would be like, try to stay away from other people that had COVID. But if you fast forward a year after, you know, people were openly saying, I have COVID, and everybody would automatically send them love and compassion. And they would say, do you need anything? Can I get you anything? That shame was removed, you know, the unknown was removed. So I feel like COVID, you know, in this time, it brought a lot of teachings. It also taught us how to pray for each other again. When I grew up, I thought that praying was synonymous with church, because we didn't talk about it at home. And the only praying I thought you did was, like, I thought praying was when you go to church and like you read those scriptures out of a Bible. I thought that's what praying was. But that has nothing to do with praying. Praying for someone is sending them that good energy and that love that they need to heal. It has nothing to do with the Bible. It has nothing to do with religion. But that's something that I didn't understand until not too long ago. Because we're so traumatized from, the residential schools that were really religious and religion based, as they were run by priests and nuns. So growing up, we have a distrust to anything that has to do with religion, and praying for each other was part of that distrust. And so it's kind of understanding that those are post effects, you know, the post-traumatic stress, the post-traumatic effects that came from residential schools impacted us in a lot of negative ways. But with the post-traumatic effects, we also have post-traumatic knowledge and post-traumatic understandings. We have intergenerational trauma, but we also have intergenerational gifts of resilience, of strength. And those are the things that I work on nurturing, because because it's easier for me to focus on those. And the other day I was talking to Aksa, my grandmother, and I asked her, like, how did you get out of not going to residential school? And she told me that she wanted to go because everybody else was going. She had her little bag packed. She was trying to get picked up to go to residential school. And her mother said no. Her mother protected her and was like, no, you're not going. And she was like, but everybody else is going. She's like, you're not going to residential school. I'm not sending you there. And so her mother protected her from that. And not everybody was lucky enough to have someone say, no, you're not going. And so even though my grandmother went to residential day school and still had that cultural genocide there, she was saved a little bit. And so I'm thankful for that and that she's still here today. She tells me stories about, long time ago, and my grandpa too. So I have a grandpa, but it's my father's father, and a grandma that's my mother's mother. But we all hang out together, and when we go places, people think that they're my parents. And so when we visit, that's all I do is I just want them to tell me stories of, because in their minds, I asked my grandpa, I said, did you think there would ever be a telephone that you could see the picture on the other side and talk to someone? And he was like, no, I never thought I would see that. So they've come from, in the 1940s and the 1950s, the communities, the indigenous communities were run by an Indian agent. And so he was a man. It's kind of like how we have, I guess, sort of, we have administration offices now. The Indian agent would take care of these communities, but I can't say take care of them. He would administer these communities. And so you would have to go to the Indian agent and you would have to ask for food, or you would have to ask for like healthcare, or you would have to ask for anything that you needed. And so my grandparents have stories of, going to the Indian agent and asking for food for their family. And the food they were given was never nutritious food. So part of cultural genocide also was, you know, not allowing us to have access to our traditional diets. So if you didn't have a garden and you didn't, have your own food sovereignty, you had to go to the Indian agent and ask for certain foods. And they gave you foods that like were government issued foods, I guess. Um, Foods that didn't have very much nutritional value. And I asked my grandfather, like, did you guys have a garden? And he said, yeah, we had a little garden. And my grandmother, they had a larger garden. Plus she was raised by her grandmother, and they had a cow and they had chickens and they had a large garden. So in that day and age, they were considered wealthy because they had more access to traditional foods. And that's one thing is indigenous wealth was never monetary. Um, our wealth was in our culture. Our wealth was in our original way of life. Our wealth was in our knowledge of the land and how we lived at one and kept that connection. And so when we talk about truth and reconciliation, we really have to reconcile with the land. We have to reconcile with our original mother, the earth, and to, to go back to those ways of not taking more than we need. we live in like a consumerism world, and it's so much that we have to step back and, bring it back to basics, the basics. And that's part of our healing that we're working on now. And it's rebuilding that relationship. So that's, I'm thankful for this opportunity to have this time to build relationships with newcomers to the land, people migrating, because if you really think about it, technically, historically, logistically, geographically, there's not really such a thing as a Canadian or an American, because the original peoples of this land, of Turtle Island, don't recognize those borders, because those borders were put here later. So everybody else who says that they're Canadian or American, they come from a different land. Every single person who isn't Indigenous has come from a different land. And it kind of made me sad that people lost that connection with the original homelands by saying, I'm Canadian or I'm American. Because it's like, where does your people really come from? And they're like, well, I was born here. I have citizenship here. My parents were born here. And, that's fine, but everybody has a homeland and you should keep that connection. That's why I appreciate it when people introduce themselves as a settler. I appreciate that. I appreciate that because you still have that connection to your original homelands. Because I couldn't imagine, I always try to put myself in somebody else's shoes. Like, I couldn't imagine being an Indigenous person of North America and say my great great grandparents moved to Europe to give me a better life. They migrated to Europe. They got citizenship. They bought land. They built a house. You know, there was other Indigenous families that followed. They built houses. They bought land. They started businesses, and then they had children. Their children had children, and then so I couldn't imagine saying that I'm European because of that's where I live. I can't imagine saying my parents were born in this country. I have European citizenship. I'm European. I feel like I would always have my connection to my homelands that, even though I had no European bloodlines, that I would be able to say I was European. So, when we talk about migration equality, every single person, except for the Indigenous people of the lands, have migrated here. And you should be proud of that. Like, be proud of your homelands. And, we need to do more teachings on each other so that we can understand, so that we can have better communications to live in this beautiful land and to understand, to not take more than we need. That's the biggest part, is reconciling with the earth. And, you know, we're still we're still here. We still appreciate allies. We're still learning. We're still healing. We're still researching. We're still doing all these things. But the most important part for Indigenous people is that we're still here, because that was something that was that they tried to wipe out. We're still here. We're still relearning our languages. We're still practicing our ceremonies. And when I speak about Indigenous people, there's many different nations, and there's many different languages. Everyone has their own cultural practices, and it's having that relationship building with each other and living on these parts of living in this part of the world together and all having that same understanding. And so coming out of all the trauma, all the hurt, all the pain, all the post effects, that's our focus today, is to move ahead with compassion. There's, there will never be a forgiveness of cultural genocide. That will never be forgiven. There can be many apologies. There can be many things that can happen, but it's just moving forward and, helping people understand the truth and why these schools existed and the damage that they caused. I remember the first time I felt racism in a school. I was in 7th grade, and in our community, our school goes to 6th grade. And after 6th grade, you go to school in the city for 7th, 8th, and then high school. And I remember being in 7th grade. It was our first time going to school with non-Indigenous, having non-Indigenous classmates. And I remember, I don't even know what happened, how it started, but one of my classmates, she told me, she was like, "What do you know? You're nothing but a stupid Indian." And I remember the rage that I felt. And like I wanted to attack her. I had that rage in me because she said that to me. And I didn't do anything. I walked out of the classroom. I didn't tell the teachers. I didn't tell anybody until later that week. I told my dad. And my dad told me, he said, "Well, do you think you're stupid?" And I said, "No, I know I'm not." And he said, "Well, why are you going to listen to her?" He said, "What does she matter? What do her words matter?" And I said, "They don't. They don't mean anything." And he said, "You have to remember that." He said, "You know that you're not stupid. You know." And I was like, I remember saying, "But I want to beat her up." And he told me, he said, "You're not going to fight this. You're not going to fight this good fight in this world by beating people up." He said, "You're going to fight the good fight in this world with knowledge and with understanding." And so it was hard for me to take that in. And I was 13. I didn't understand the words he was saying to me then. I understand them now. But to be in that place then at that young age, I can only imagine the rage that was felt by all the people in residential schools. The rage they felt every time someone said something negative to them, every time someone abused them, every time someone tried to break them down. So that rage you know, they didn't have someone to tell them it doesn't matter what they say. You're going to fight this good fight with knowledge and understanding. They didn't have that. So I'm thankful that I did. And so that's why I share the things I shared today, is so that we can have that knowledge and that understanding coming through trauma, because it's not an easy battle, but it's something that we continue to fight daily as an Indigenous person, as an Ongwehoe person of this land. We're still fighting so many injustices, and we need allies. So I'm thankful for this opportunity. I'm thankful that you listened with a compassionate mind. I I didn't know how deep to go with sharing about residential schools, but I wanted to do this as an understanding. And that's why I do the work I do today, to build those bridges of communication. We're building bridges of communication in our own communities. We're building bridges of communication in our own homes with our own families, because now we understand why our parents did what they did, why our grandparents did what they did. So we're moving forward. We're still struggling. There's still trauma, but we're still moving forward. And I think that's all we can really do in this time and age, is keep moving forward with a compassionate mind, and hopefully everything will start to fall in place in a good way. I wish I had a magic wand where I could make people not hurt anymore, but I know it takes a lot of work. And I know people that have, once you start working on your trauma, it's kind of re-traumatizing for them to work on their trauma and to get that help. So it's really finding the balance and bringing that goodness back in to my people. So, and that's the work I do today. Wade gwanu heladu sungwaya dizu. Jiska waskwaya dinyut. Asqua nigu lahladi. Jit deyungwa walyuhadi. Daknauwa wat wat yungwali kashu. Jit niole oya jit dwadla. So what I just said was, I thank the Creator for bringing us together today, and that He'll watch over us as we travel. And we're also going to separate our minds, because I brought our minds together to listen. I'm not going to separate our minds to go back to your homes and your work and your family until we meet again. So yeah, I'll go for today, and it's building those communications that I'm thankful for.